Russia is formally protesting the weapon shipments that the United States is sending to Ukraine. And in this diplomatic memo, warning of a, quote, unprecedented consequences if those weapons keep flowing into the country. Let's go straight to Kylie Atwood. She joins us out front tonight at the State Department. So, Kylie, I mean, it is a stark warning, right? They use these words, unprecedented, unpredictable consequences, and then they don't say what they are. How is the U.S. responding?
Yeah, Poppy, it's a threatening diplomatic note. No way else to cut it. But what Biden administration officials are saying is that these words aren't going to have an impact on their policy of continued support for Ukraine, continued military support for Ukraine. State Department spokesperson Ned Price said that Russia has said things in public, they have said things in private, but nothing is going to dissuade the Biden administration from the strategy that they are pursuing here of that continued military support for Ukraine. And the timeline here sort of underscores or gives some credence to those comments, because our reporting is that this diplomatic note was received by the Biden administration on Tuesday, and President Biden went forth with his plans to announce additional military support from the U.S. to Ukraine on Wednesday, indicating that even though they'd received this message from the Russians, they weren't going to be dissuaded. They were going to move forward. And when you talk to Biden administration officials about what this message from the Russians indicates about their standing right now, they believe that it indicates that Russia is hurting, that this military support from the U.S. to Ukraine is being effective. And some Biden administration officials believe Russia wouldn't have sent such a diplomatic note if they felt that they were in a strong standing on the battlefield.
Right. That makes sense. Kylie, thank you so much for the reporting tonight. Kylie Atwood at the State Department. Let's talk a lot more about this. I want to bring in retired Army Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt and Ronald Marks, a former CIA official who oversaw actions against Russian spying operations. Thank you, gentlemen, both so much for joining us. And General Kimmitt, let me begin with you, because when you have the Russians in this diplomatic memo, if you will, warning of unpredictable consequences if the U.S. keeps giving weapons to Ukraine, which it will, what does that even mean, unpredictable consequences?
Well, first of all, I think we've got to put this diplomatic note, this démarche from the Russians, in context. A démarche is something that happens almost on a daily basis inside the State Department. I would not make too much of this. If there were really unpredictable consequences and the Russians truly meant it, they wouldn't be doing this through a diplomatic note. They'd actually be doing this directly to the Department of Defense or to Jake Sullivan. So I think this was more about using the typical State Department protocol and nothing more than that.
So, Ronald, I mean, one of the unpredictable consequences could be, let's hope not, could be Putin using we're hearing a lot in the last 48 hours about a tactical nuclear weapon, potentially, something we heard the CIA director warn about yesterday. And then we just heard Ukrainian President Zelensky tell my colleague Jake Tapper today that the world should be worried that Putin might do that. How real do you believe that possibility is tonight?
Well, let's face it. I mean, Putin wants a win on this from the marrow of his bones. Now, how far he's willing to go on this is something else. Everybody's frightened of nuclear weapons. Nothing has been used in the battlefield since August of 1945. He knows what that means. So the very threat of it, I think, is enough to make people begin to stand up. You know, is he going to use something? They have the father of all bombs, which is, I think, 44 tons or something like that of explosive thermobaric bomb. Would they use that on the battlefield? Yeah, I'm sure they would, because they're looking to inflict casualties. But in terms of nuclear weapons, you know, I would say it's a possibility, but not a probability.
General Kimmitt, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken told European allies the U.S. believes at this point that this war could last through the end of 2022. And we know the Kremlin is promising that its military goals will be achieved, it seems, at pretty much any cost. What would you expect Russia's tactics to become? More brutal as this becomes more protracted?
Well, first of all, I think we've got to look at the new commander they've been putting in charge. Right. General Dvornikov is a pretty tough guy, pretty tough in Syria, human rights violations, flattening cities such as Aleppo. He did the same thing in the operations against Crimea very quickly, and he did Crimea as well. So I would expect him to feel unconstrained on the level of brutality he would be willing to use. They would not only fight at the front lines, these vaunted offensives that everybody's talking about, but I would expect to see continued shelling of cities, continued human rights violations, continued firing on civilian targets. So I don't think we can understate the level of brutality that we would see over the next months to come on the part of the Russians.
And just think what we've seen in Bucha, those mass graves, in Mariupol, et cetera. Ronald, a source tells CNN that in a recent conversation with President Biden, President Zelensky asked the U.S. to designate Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. U.S. officials have not ruled that out in the past. What difference would that make? Do you think that's something the administration should do?
Well, it's certainly a symbolic effort. I mean, you do have, it is the bad guys list. I mean, it's Korea, it's North Korea rather, it's Cuba, it's Syria, et cetera. You know, the function of sanctions and all that, I tend to be a little more skeptical about their longer term. It does make a statement. And also, by the way, it makes a statement to the G7, because the G7 also have the equivalent of that article as well. But I'm not so sure, frankly, when it's all said and done. It's symbolic. It's important. I think it's an indicative level of sort of a marking of the Russians at this point, perhaps one more along the line. And I understand why they would want to have it, but when it's all said and done, I really doubt the efficacy of it.
General Kimmett, in an interview, a fascinating interview with President Zelensky published today in The Atlantic, he voiced a lot of frustration over repeated questions about which weapons Ukraine needs the most, questions from the U.S., the West. And I was struck by his quote in the interview. He said, "When some leaders ask me what weapons I need a moment to calm myself because I already told them the week before. It's Groundhog Day. I feel like Bill Murray," obviously knowing the audience, right, that he's speaking to clearly. What do you make of that? I mean, he feels like I'm saying it over and over again. Do you not hear me? Who do I need to tell?
Right, but that's got to be balanced against the policy that the United States has, which is we will do this operation by, with, and through NATO. And NATO is an organization of 30 countries. And when you have a coalition like that and you want to maintain consensus, oftentimes you have to go to the lowest common denominator. So if 2 or 3 countries object to a no-fly zone, or 2 or 3 countries are worried that a too aggressive nature would put their countries in NATO at risk, at this point we seem to be abiding by that least common denominator. There's a question whether that shopping list of President Zelensky may be too excessive, but I think this really comes down to more and more that simply to keep this coalition of 30 countries together, President Biden and some of the hawks, more hawkish countries are trying to balance what they're trying to do with those other countries, particularly those that are on the border with Russia right now.
General Kimmett, Ronald Marks, thank you both very much.